if I had like a crystal ball, I would say like that class of medications for longevity purposes will become one of the greatest things that we have ever. And then even in the short term, what it's doing for people's health that I've witnessed firsthand, from like reducing high blood pressure, reducing cholesterol. How would diabetic drugs end up improving heart health that much?
Yeah.
And it's because it's taking that metabolic burden off of the body.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Bill Kapp. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Fountain Life, and your host today for the conversation here with Hunter Williams. We're going to explore breakthroughs today, technologies and forward-leading strategies that are really helping to shape the future of longevity and performance. I'm really excited to introduce Hunter here today because his work is really pushing the boundaries of what we can achieve in preventive and optimized health. And particularly, he's a peptide expert, which is an area that we're very interested in here at Fountain Life. We have some peptides we offer, but we really want to increase that offering and really, be able to scale that. Hunter's a respected educator, and has a remarkable ability to take complex biological science and turn it into practical, actionable, and accessible information that for anyone really who's looking to elevate their health span. He's operating at the leading edge of therapeutic peptides, hormone optimization, metabolic function, and the evolving science of performance longevity. Through his podcast and courses and online communities, he's helped tens of thousands of people understand how to strategically leverage peptides, hormones, and intelligent lifestyle to improve their well-being and extend vitality. This is a conversation worth paying close attention to as Hunter really helps us get some insights into this really unusual area of peptides, and particularly a rare blend of scientific rigor and real world application. So it's a pleasure to welcome you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Kapp. It's a privilege and honor to be here. I know just from talking before we started, we're going to be geeking out a lot today, so I'm really excited. And thank you for having me here. This is a total blessing. So it's been awesome here. So
glad to have you here. It's really exciting. We are. This is our first podcast, so we're excited to have you.
Oh wow, thank you.
So we're here to bless our podcast studio, and then more importantly, hopefully launch us on being able to provide information. Really, our goal here is really educate more than anything else. We do a lot of really cool things at Fountain, but really what we want to do is educate the public about what's available. Yeah. And I think that's super important. So what I'd like to do is segue a little bit because, a lot of our Fountain Life viewers, be hearing this for the first time, and they may not be fully familiar with your story and how you wound up as a biohacker because it was out of necessity. Right. And so maybe we could talk a little bit about your history, and then we could kind of delve into what you've discovered along the way.
Yeah. So growing up, I'll make it as short as I can, but I always tell people before I remember, I wanted to be a professional football player. I don't remember a time where I chose that. I just remember, hey, that's what I did. And that's what I wanted to do. My parents didn't push that on me. I mean, obviously, my dad, he played football in high school or whatever. But they even said like before, when I was 3 years old, I would like be banging on the TV, like for football games, when I was a baby. And so for me, I was just always an athlete. And to me, that was everything, like in high school, when kids go to party or whatever, all I cared about, I had like one focus, and that was to go to college to play football so that I could go to the NFL, because that was my passion in life. And I did really well in school, but I always tell people like not the only reason, but like the reason I did well in school is because I wanted to play football. And I knew like if I didn't get a scholarship to play football, like I would have a backup plan to go walk on somewhere. And that's what I ended up doing. So played high school football, ended up walking on to the football team at Wake Forest University because I was able to get some financial aid to go there, and then got a scholarship and started there for 3 years. Ended up having a pretty successful career. I was by no means like All-American or anything like that. But for me, it was like validation, because that was my dream, is to play football, especially in the ACC, because I'm from North Carolina, and that was, what my dream was as a little kid. And so for me, that was like validation. And I played linebacker. And when I look back, there were times when I was like 8 years old, 15 years old, 22 years old, to where I would have some of these like hits that were just like insane, to like where you kind of don't know what's going on. And I was never diagnosed with a concussion, because back then there was no concussion protocol. It was like, you got your bell rung and you're either knocked out or you're good to go.
Right.
And so I grew up doing that. And so like, I remember looking back, like there was one time in high school where I got hit in a game. It was like a playoff game. And the next 3 weeks I had like AP US history, and like AP or pre-calculus or something like that. And I remember trying to do my homework for like weeks after that game. I could not like sit down. Every time I would try to do my homework, like my brain would just throb or whatever. I was like, okay, there's probably something going on here, but also too, my livelihood depends on me being good at this game to like be able to pay for my college. You know, my parents were going to pay for my college and like to make it in life. And I was like, okay, I'm not, going to say anything. And so anyway, go through that. Similar things happen in college, where you have hits that are just like, man, you like see your life flash before your eyes. I remember one time we were practicing, we were about to play Notre Dame my senior year. And so for me, as like a kid that grew up being a football fan, this was like everything. It was like, I get to play Notre Dame at Notre Dame my senior year, like go out, they were ranked like number 3 in the country. And I remember the Thursday practice, which is usually like a walkthrough practice. I remember a wide receiver ran across the field and I just didn't see him. And we like ran into each other and he went down, he like pretty much like blacked out. And I just got up and I remember thinking like, I couldn't see straight. And I was like, don't let them see that something's wrong with me, because I didn't work for 16 years to not to get to play my senior year at Notre Dame, even if we're going to get our butts whooped. Like I wasn't going to let that happen, and be a captain and do everything that I wanted to do. And so that's just how it was. And so graduated, like wanted to make it to the NFL, didn't make it to the NFL. And after that, got into working in real estate, and I was like 24, 25 years old. And I started to notice like, I'm eating like very healthy. I'm training, not like an athlete, but like very similar, like staying in great shape. And my health is just not seeing there. Like my mental health was not good. I was kind of like depressed and anxious. And I was like, well, maybe it's just, stress from work and life and figuring life out when you're in your 20s. But it just kind of hung around and I never felt right. I was like, I don't feel like myself. And I've never felt like this. Anyway, through like, we were talking about Dr. Mark Gordon earlier. I'd heard him on some podcast and I realized that there could be an association, which at the time I didn't know anything about testosterone levels. I was like, I'm a football player. I have high testosterone levels, right? I used to run into people for a living. And, between testosterone levels and post or traumatic brain injury and concussions, and heard him on a podcast. And I was like, well, let me just like go get blood work and find out like what it would be. Luckily, I was in the care of a great doctor at that time. He was able to put me on testosterone therapy when I was 27 years old. And so I've been on that since, and it completely changed my life. And then being in the hormone world, that kind of gets you interested in other stuff like peptides. And so I started researching peptides and learning more about them and learn more about those. And then fortuitously just like started publishing stuff online, just talking about it and talking about personal experience. And that led me to coaching people and, doing what I do today. But it kind of came out of necessity because I was like, hey, I've got to fix this problem in my life, which is that like, I don't make as much testosterone as I should. And that led me into that, and then led me into the peptide world. And then you realize once you get into that there's like this whole other world out there that had I gone to like a regular doctor, he probably would have said, you need an SSRI and you need probably like Cialis or Viagra or something.
I know that.
And,
No doubt.
and luckily that's not what happened. I had a good doctor and he took me through tests and everything to make sure everything was okay. But unfortunately that's what we're up against, is like, that would have been the pathway of matching the symptom to the drug versus like actually optimizing and healing the root cause.
So this journey from kind of where you went into the peptide world, let's talk about that a little bit, because, I'd like to talk a little bit about where peptides are today. And, there's a lot out there, obviously, but we should maybe for some of the people that are going to listen, talk a little bit about the history of peptides, kind of where we think they may have started. And we know they've got a long-standing history outside the U.S. And then kind of where they are today. And then I'd like to get into some specifics about, different stacks and things that you might find really interesting and things that you think people should definitely look at, and which ones are legal and which ones aren't. And we'll kind of evolve into that.
Yeah, for sure. I love peptides. Obviously, I talk about them all day. If you go back to the history, my best guess would be that insulin was probably the first like widely discovered and synthesized peptide. I don't know exactly what year that was. We're probably going back 100 years ago or more. We had insulin to be able to help people with diabetes. So that was the example. Hey, here's an exogenous peptide that we can take to use to help heal disease. Now, that's obviously, we have way better things than that now to help people that are diabetic. But to go to your point, peptides, most of them were actually born a lot out of Russia. And if you look at the Cold War in the United States and Russia, in Russia, they were kind of forced to figure out some of this stuff to it be able to like either help their soldiers or their space program or whatever. And then even when we had Chernobyl, which was the nuclear disaster that happened, I've actually talked to people that are from Russia that were kind of born out of that they had to figure out a way to heal some of this radiation poisoning. And so a lot of the peptides that are now becoming mainstream in America actually have been used in Russia for 70 or 80 years. There's even some of these peptides called bioregulator peptides, which are very short chains of amino acid peptides that in some cases are actually bioavailable orally, so you can take them orally, that were born out of the Kavinson Institute. A guy named Dr. Victor Kavinson was kind of the mastermind behind a lot of these peptide protocols that came out of Russia. So when we look at clinical data, a lot of people will say, well, like, hey, we don't know about peptides, right? Because it's a gray area. They're not FDA approved. And we do have a lot of data on them, maybe not so much human data in the way that we typically would for like a Prozac, but we have a lot of data that's either in Russian that hasn't been translated into English, or just other countries that have used these. Just to give you an example, for instance, one peptide called thymosin alpha 1. It's kind of considered an immunity peptide. That's approved in 35 countries, actually as an adjunct to chemotherapy. Because when you do chemotherapy, it suppresses the immune system, and thymosin alpha 1 helps stimulate the immune system. So it actually, whether or not you believe in chemotherapy, it actually improves patient mortality outcomes for patients that are using chemotherapy because it helps support the immune system, which is obviously suppressed from chemotherapy. And so in the United States, that's not FDA approved, but in 35 other countries, they see it's good enough. Another good example would be cerebral iacin. That's a peptide that it actually is derived from pigs. And if we think about peptides, like people are very familiar with taking like organ extracts of an animal, right? Like we have desiccated beef liver extract that you can go buy on Amazon. A lot of peptides are derived in similar ways, and cerebral iacin is derived in that way from porcine material. And actually it's common practice in a lot of countries in Eastern Europe to keep cerebral iacin on an ambulance so that if someone has a stroke, they immediately administer an IV of cerebral iacin to help with any inflammation that would come in the brain as a result of the stroke. So peptides have a much longer history than people realize. In the United States, they've probably been around the way that we think of them for like the last 20 years. You started to see like compounding pharmacies that were making them, like your BPCs and your PB500s, started doing that about 20 years ago. You kind of had like this whole research world that kind of sprouted up as a result of that was in a lot of cases like compounding pharmacies just selling them out the back door. So it kind of like populated the underground in the bodybuilding community. And there was kind of like, like a grassroots movement there. But now you've seen it obviously take hold of mainstream medicine, because when doctors look, like I've talked to so many doctors, including yourself, like that really care about the patient. I really say like, hey, I have someone that has, a torn labrum on their shoulder. Do I want to give them surgery, or could I potentially heal this with a non-surgical intervention? There's overwhelming, I guess we would have to call it anecdotal because we don't have, like PubMed studies on it. There's overwhelming anecdotal evidence to say like, hey, I had a patient that took this and it prevented them from having surgery, or it helped them heal in half the time that they would have normally healed with their surgery. So contrary to like what might be like popular that people would see online, peptides have been used going back tons of time. And just now that we're talking about it, there's a peptide called DSIP, which is called delta sleep inducing peptide. That was actually studied all the way back in the 80s for opioid withdrawal. Oh, wow. And so what that does is a peptide that stimulates deep sleep to raise your delta wave sleep when you're sleeping. But through doing that, somehow it was discovered in the 80s that it would prevent severe opioid withdrawal symptoms. And so you had people coming off opioids and they could actually administer this peptide to where it would calm their nervous system down and prevent some of the withdrawal symptoms. So if you do some digging, there is a lot of data, but as we well know, we're kind of up against, a bigger, side of the equation of an industry that might not want to necessarily heal some of those root causes because, like you said, some of those prescribed drugs are pretty entrenched monetarily and financially.
Well, they're part of the culture, unfortunately. I mean, it's interesting. I think I was listening to RFK Jr. recently speak about, the U.S. consumes 90% of the world's opioids.
Wow, that's crazy.
Prescription opioids, right? I mean, I always tell people, we're one of the two countries in the world that allow you to advertise drugs online.
Yeah.
Everybody else has kind of banned it, but the drugs are all for symptoms. And I was joking with my wife because we were watching. She likes to watch the Hallmark Channel during Christmas, and there was a drug there for which it was for what they call OIC. Everything's got a nice little acronym: opioid induced constipation. And I'm like going, okay, well, you probably shouldn't be on the opioid in the first place, but now we got a drug when you get constipated, we can take that too. So what we're finding, and we see this in our Fountain Life patients, people come in and a lot of times they're on 10, 15 medications. And once again, it's one drug to chase a symptom, to chase a symptom, chase a symptom. But yet we have these things like peptides, which are normal a lot of them are normally constituents either found in other species, or in the U.S. or in your own human body, right? These are things that your body just makes, and it just stops making as much of it, or for whatever reason, and then we can't give it back, right? Because there's no quote double-blinded study through the FDA. So let's talk a little bit about first of all, outside the U.S., obviously these are widely available. In the U.S., what is widely available and which ones? And then, obviously we have the ones that are quote research grade only, which is kind of just a way of kind of get around some of the FDA regulations. But, of the ones that you're familiar with here, and one of the things we're very interested in at Fountain Life is, providing a cache and an area of peptides that, we won't get in trouble necessarily, but at the same time, being able to offer those as an adjunct to, optimization.
I think the first and probably the class that most people are familiar with now is the GLP-1 peptides. Those are huge. And I think a lot of people, I'll say like in our longevity community, probably in the last couple of years have viewed those as more in a negative light because of some of the media around some of the side effects that come out of them. And so when we look at those, it's like, okay, well, let's look at what's really going on here and let's drill down to what's happening. And so on one side of things, you have physicians that are prescribing GLP-1 peptides, which would be like your Wegovy, Ozempic, Zepbound, or Mounjaro, or the names for tirzepatide. And you have physicians that are prescribing them. And in order to maximize insurance reimbursement, they're escalating the dose way faster than you would actually need to get a therapeutic effect to help a patient lose weight. And so there's been a lot of bad press around those peptides because people haven't treated them in the right way. What I like to tell people is they're more a catalyst to create weight loss and change in people's life than they are a lever, meaning that you just hit the button and the weight comes off, right? And you can do that, but you're going to have pretty bad consequences. But when we look at it from a longevity perspective, if we look at like, okay, what causes aging the fastest? Metabolic dysfunction is going to cause inflammation that leads to aging and chronic disease. And if you look what GLP-1s are doing at the right dose, administered the right way, and without being like overdosed and not as an adjunct to lifestyle intervention and also other interventions, like hormone therapy, if necessary, like other peptides that are endogenous to us, because even though they're very similar, like you don't have tirzepatide in your body. Whereas like a BPC, we all have in our stomachs. Sure. But I think when you look at what they do from a metabolic health standpoint, as it stands right now, they're one of the best, if not the best, longevity medicines that are available because they help stem the tide of inflammation, meaning the metabolic dysfunction that leads to inflammation that causes aging. They can help reverse that if you use them properly. The problem is most people, they might need to lose 70 pounds and they start at 2.5 milligrams of Mounjaro, and then they go to 5 milligrams, and then they go to 10 and 15, and they look in their 25 milligrams, and they may have lost weight, but they've shut down their thyroid, they have stomach paralysis, they're constipated, and they have all these issues. They can't eat enough protein, they're losing muscle, and so they have all these issues. So I think for familiarity's sake, the GLP-1s are some of the greatest interventions we have, but I would say, and there's discussion around like what this means, using them at a microdose periodically throughout the year is one of like the best longevity medications we have. And that could be if you need to lose like 50 pounds, or even if you don't need to lose any weight. What I've seen in myself and a lot of the people that I coach that are on these, that have them prescribed from their doctor, is nothing but improvement in lipid panels, which is crazy relative to like statins, what it does to, all the the catastrophic consequences of statins, improvement in inflammation, improvement in chronic pain, reduction in alcohol consumption, all these other things. And there was actually just a study that came out in October of this year that of all of metabolic associated cancer, which I think is 40% of all diagnosed cancer is associated with metabolic dysfunction. Altogether, there was a 17% reduction when they control for every other variable, reduction risk in that cancer in the last 10 years for people on GLPs. And when we look at that, those were not really people that are changing their lifestyle. They're really just injecting whatever the doctor tells them to. They're still eating the same thing. And when you look at, like, I think it was 86,000 patients in that analysis. Wow. When you look at that and you have a 17% reduction in cancer, and then even some subsects, there was like in ovarian cancer, there was like a 47% reduction in ovarian cancer. There's something that's going on there with those that we're just like scratching the surface of. And I think in the next few years, hopefully we figure out a better way to implement those intelligently rather than just doing the same thing we've done with every other drug, which is like give people as much as you can and get them hooked on it, as long as you can, rather than using it, in a cyclical manner and also using it at a much lower dose than people probably think they need.
Well, I love to hear you talk about that because I think that they are one of the longevity drugs. And I think we're going to see this, interestingly, at the age-related drug development conference that was just in Copenhagen. Mm-hmm. The CEO of Eli Lilly was there.
Oh, wow.
And he basically stood up and he said, semaglutide is the first longevity drug. We believe this at Eli Lilly. Now, I think you're totally right. The doses are way off the chart. I can tell you our data at Fountain Life has been really interesting because what we have seen is it crushes liver fat. That whereas, because we measure everything, as you know, because if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. Yeah. But one of the things we do is we look heavily at what people's liver fat is. And literally 26% of our members, and by the way, we have a, pretty fortunate group of people that are able to come in and go through testing and can afford it. And we're going to democratize it over time. But 26% of people elevated liver fat. And these are people who know about diet and exercise. Yeah. And literally, when you put them on GLP-1s, it crushes their liver fat to well below 4% in a very short period of time. Wow. And so it's probably going to address, that. And then as far as the ovarian dysfunction, PCOS, polycystic ovarian disease, which is one of the biggest problems we're dealing with. And people talk about it being like type 3 diabetes, right? It's blood sugar inflammation issues. And so blood sugar is the number one inflammatory substance in your body, whether you bring it from inside or when you get it, for instance, as you age, your hormonal decline happens, right? And so particularly males, your testosterone level drops, whether your muscle mass drops, which is your number one glucose sink. And so you're going to wind up with higher blood sugar over time. And that blood sugar, we believe long-term is what, stimulates this whole inflammatory cascade. So I think it's a great drug. And I think you're right. I think there are a lot of ways that we have to get around that one. And I think, in terms of getting people dosed on a microdose, cycling like every other part of your body, I think it's super helpful. Outside of GLP-1s though, what's the next one you would recommend or that people should really be looking at? Because, there are lots of things. Obviously losing weight is one. Obviously another thing I should mention is that there's some really interesting data around cognitive improvement on GLP-1s as well, right? Yeah. So people who have early stage cognitive decline or have just seen, really big improvements in that, particularly with things like dementia.
Yeah. Another class of peptides, and there's a bunch of different ones in this class, some are FDA approved, some are not, is the growth hormone peptide class. Mm-hmm. So you'd have growth hormone releasing hormones and then growth hormone releasing peptides. For all intents and purposes, both of those classes of peptides or hormones work to help the body raise its natural growth hormone production. And what I always like to tell people, because if I'm like building out a comprehensive plan or working with someone to do that, a lot of people are like, okay, well, like I can take a GLP-1, right? But don't I have to like keep upping the dose? And the answer is no. In a lot of cases, like we want to use the GLP-1 as a catalyst, and then we can actually use some of these other peptides to increase our metabolic health on a completely different pathway through a completely different mechanism that is contributing to the same goal, which is obviously longevity. And when we look at that, like for instance, one would be ceramorelin, another one would be tesamorelin. Tesamorelin's a little bit stronger. Both of those are growth hormone releasing hormones. Mm-hmm. And what they do is they stimulate the pituitary gland to go through a bunch of processes, but basically raise the body's natural growth hormone production in the body. And if you look at growth hormone and IGF, what happens is after the age of like 25 or 30, that just falls off a cliff. And then we get into our 40s and 50s, and we really don't have that much left. Some people may or may not. It's kind of variable to the individual. But I know for me, like going back to pituitary function, that was another thing alongside of my testosterone that was also impaired because the pituitary is involved in that process of producing growth hormone, and also growth hormone peptides made a massive improvement in my life, particularly for me, like with my sleep, because if you have lower growth hormone, it affects your deep wave sleep. And if you raise that, it can do it. And what's cool about the peptides is, as opposed to exogenous growth hormone administration of like bioidentical growth hormone, it's sending a signal to the body to make more of it as if we were younger. So it's raising that. Now you still have to use intelligence around those because you wouldn't want to use too high of a dose for too long. And if we raise growth hormone too much, there could be some like downsides, such as like insulin resistance and things of that nature. But when used intelligently, and if you were to like use a growth hormone or peptide alongside of a GLP-1, all of a sudden now I'm retaining more muscle, I'm burning more fat via a completely different pathway than the GLP. And so I can stay or use a lower dose of that GLP and then also get all these other cool benefits, which is better sleep, usually better hair, better skin, better nails, and then also easier to build muscle if I'm weight training, and then easier to burn fat if I'm, living healthy. And so that's another class that I think should be kind of like one of those things that, like, as we age, that should be kind of like a stock consideration of like, okay, let's look at that first, like, in blood work and different tests. And then what can we do to improve that? And when we look at those peptides, like some of the data is pretty cool around what they do to reduce visceral fat, improve deep sleep, and just overall make us healthier.
So do you need to cycle those? Because there's some people say you should cycle these 5 days on, 2 days off, or, just cycle. I mean, what are your thoughts around that? Because I think, more is not always better. And I think people forget that the body does need some recovery time. What do you recommend for people?
I'm a big fan of cycling those. And a lot of times too, I actually would recommend cycling shorter cycles than maybe even some of the pharmaceutical prescribing guidelines around those are. So for instance, tesamorelin, it was originally developed for men with HIV lipodystrophy, which is where they get, really nasty visceral fat around their midsection. And if you look at studies of that, I think it's I'm quoting off the top of my head, but within 6 months, like over half of the people develop anti-drug antibodies to the peptide, meaning that the body is having kind of this innate immune response to a foreign substance. It's not bad, but basically, like, you inject something foreign into the body, it's going to start to build up tolerance to it, as with pretty much any medication. And the benefit of cycling is that, one, we can take like an 8 or a 12-week window where we're using that peptide to get all the benefits that we want. And then we cycle off of it for, usually around the same amount of time that I was using it. There's a couple benefits to that. One, we avoid any sort of the negative side effects that would come from like elevating growth hormone. So a lot of people get concerned with like growth hormone and cancer risk, and growth hormone and increasing insulin resistance. When you're cycling, you're kind of pulsing. And so you're going up and then the body is coming back to homeostasis. So we harness these benefits without chronically elevating a hormone that we wouldn't want necessarily elevated for a long period of time. So there's that benefit. And then there's also too the benefit of keeping the body sensitive to it. Meaning that if we're developing these anti-drug antibodies to it, what eventually will happen is that you have to increase the dose over time. And so maybe that doesn't happen for someone for a year. Maybe they could stay on it for a year and get benefits before they have to start doing it. Everyone's going to be a little bit different. But when you cycle, you're maintaining sensitivity to the peptide. And so it allows you to harness the benefits and then resensitize yourself to it and stay in a healthy range without having to worry about escalating the dose, to which, not that this would happen in every case, but in some cases there could be bad, like a lot of these have like parabolic curves, right? There's like a therapeutic threshold dose. And then if you go too high, it falls off a cliff. So I'm a big fan of cycling. And also too, it allows people to like get familiar with it, because I think a lot of times when we're using a peptide, so the best way to explain this is through an example. Is like we get accustomed to it. And so people will use a GLP-1, and I'm a fan of cycling GLPs because it's the same thing. So they'll use it for a year and then they come off and now they're ravenously hungry. And I always say, well, like, let's think about this for a second. Are you ravenously hungry? Or are you actually just going back to where you were before, but your body became so accustomed to blasting this one pathway, which is the GLP-1 pathway, that all of a sudden you've like dysregulated your appetite a little bit now and you don't know what it feels like. And I think when we look at cycling, it helps guard against that. So even if we took like, like the sensitivity issue out of the equation, it allows people to like get really familiar with their body and have a sample size of like, okay, I know that this peptide is going to have this effect, but I don't want to like get so accustomed to that my body necessarily becomes like in need of that all the time to like have the intended outcome.
So let's talk a little bit about, you talk about tesamorelin and sermorelin, and those have been around for a while and, obviously available, legal, quote unquote, even off label indications, that we may want to use them for. What about some of the ones that are not, quote, legal, but they're kind of in this gray zone, like CJC 1295, ipamorelin? There's a bunch of these. I mean, and then, what are your thoughts around, which of those, are, first of all, the FDA is hot and cold. One day compounding pharmacies can't make them, and the next day they can make them, and so we're kind of waiting for clarity on that. But what are your thoughts around particularly things like CJC? Because a lot of people really like that, and it's got great function and great ability.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of them. Obviously, the FDA is not. There's actually, I think it was September of 2024, they came out with this list, and it's called the bulks list, and there's probably like 20 of the most popular peptides on there. And I'm quoting off of memory, but it's basically like, as the FDA, we advise guidance against prescribing these because there's not enough human data. Well, I've probably seen more human data just anecdotally coaching people that are using these than like what you would see in a published study that gets approved for something. And again, I know that is not like clinically rigorous enough, but in practice, I'm a huge fan of CJC. And when you see CJC 1295 no DAC, what that means is that it's actually just CJC. There's another version that has something called drug affinity complex on it that extends the half-life, which in a lot of cases you don't necessarily want for a growth hormone peptide, because you want a pulse, which means you like want to raise it for a short window and then have it to like return to baseline levels. I'm a big fan of both of those. And I can talk about two of like, so CJC exists, it's like sermorelin and tesamorelin on the growth hormone releasing hormone side of things. And then ipamorelin is a growth hormone releasing peptide. And all that means to say is that they work slightly different from a pathway standpoint. So ipamorelin is a ghrelin agonist, which means that it tells the brain to make more ghrelin, which then causes more of a growth hormone release. Whereas CJC, tesamorelin, and sermorelin, they are a growth hormone releasing hormone, which works through a couple of different pathways that is different than the ghrelin pathway to release growth hormone. And what happens is you get this 1 + 1 = 3 effect, because you hit two different pathways in the brain to release growth hormone, and you get more of an effect than just taking double the dose of one of them, and you get more benefit without the side effect of like doubling the dose. I really like CJC when we look at it from an effect standpoint, because it's a little bit more mild than tesamorelin. Tesamorelin is pretty strong. And so a lot of people, it works, but they might get bloating, they might get water retention, whereas CJC, you don't see that as much. And it pairs really nicely with ipamorelin. So again, not FDA approved. It's obviously on that bulks list, but when you look at it in practice, I've seen time and time again, people, usually those are like gateway peptides. So it's kind of like their first foray, because they're pretty much, I mean, you can't say nothing is side effect free. They're relatively side effect free. They're easy to use, and almost everyone, young, old, man, woman, benefits from them. So I'm a big fan of those. I like the pairing of those two different ones together, because it hits two slightly different pathways to get kind of a synergistic effect.
So you can't get it. So you can't get that through most compounding pharmacies. So where do people get them? And then where do you get them that are safe? Because one of the things we know is, China has flooded the peptide market through all kinds of different areas, making sure what you get, if you get it online, where's the quality control? I mean, it's one thing when you have a compounding pharmacy that's regulated, and at least we know that they're at least checking the bulk substances. But, there are people that will sell these online, and you don't always know where you're getting them. And so, so where do people source those? And I'm not looking for an advocating this. I'm just saying that we know that people are getting these. So if they are getting them, and they're determined to get them, you could go overseas and get them probably and try to bring them back in the US, but what would people do with those? I mean, where do they source those?
Yeah. And here's kind of the misnomer right now, is a lot of times you have the compounding pharmacy world, which obviously if you can get them from there is great because there's a chain of custody around the whole manufacturing process. Some compounders I've heard they're like, hey, we're not going to play around with those. We're done with them. I've heard other ones that they've built several like $100 million businesses on making peptides, whether it's GLPs or growth hormone peptides or whatever. And they say, hey, we're going to roll with it until maybe the regulation changes and kind of roll the dice and say, like, if the enforcement doesn't come for us, we're going to keep doing it. And there's a market for it. So you could go that way, but like it's obviously kind of dicey, like it's hard to find and it's out there. Now we look at the research side of the world. That's like a good chunk of the market where people are buying from a website online that says for research purposes only. And the thing with that is that the website is selling it. They're indemnifying themselves and saying, hey, we're selling this to you. And if you use it, that's on you because we told you not to use it as a human. This is not for you to use as a human. Now, does that mean that all of them are bad? Not necessarily. What gets kind of weird is that as far as I understand it, there's no raw material peptides made in the US right now. And so all of the raw ingredients to make peptides are coming from China. In a lot of cases, that's even the case for compounding pharmacies. They just have a chain of custody of like where it's made and then like how it gets synthesized here in the US. And it's the same thing with research peptides. All the raw materials, to my knowledge, come from China. And then they're either made here in the US or they're made in China and then sent here. So what people have to do, and again, I'm not advocating for this, but if you're going to go that route, please be extremely diligent in your research around purity and quality testing. And so what I tell people is like, hey, if you're going to go that route, there are third-party labs that you can send samples of these to. So take the money, if you're going to invest in peptides, take the money, send off a sample and make sure it is what it says it is. In a lot of cases, the worst case, I think they're just getting like, sugar in the vial. So there's not like, I've rarely seen a lot of stuff that is like, negative reaction. Ironically, I've seen like, a lot of cases where people have negative reactions from stuff at compounding pharmacies, maybe more so than the research world. But there is, like it's an unregulated market. And much like, cannabis was 15 or 20 years ago, or these other things that are out there, there's people that are out there doing it. So I always tell people like, again, to go to the idea of like being the CEO of your own health, like take that in control, test for purity and quality. It might cost a couple $100, but at least, and then also if someone is if a company is selling those online, if they're reputable, they're going to offer those for you. So they're going to have them third-party tested on their own. And they're going to say, hey, look, this came back with no endotoxins, no lipopolysaccharides, no sort of impurities or anything like that. It is what it says it is. And yeah, you have to take that at face value if you're relying on the company provided, but reputable ones will do that. So it's one of those things like people are going to do that, obviously in a perfect world, we'd be able to get a prescription and walk down to Walgreens on every corner in America and be able to get, high quality peptides. In my experience, like most of the companies are trying to do the right thing for people, but it's also one of those things, like Ronald Reagan said, trust, but verify and trust it, but also do your homework and verify it because, it's just like anything else. And I think I read a study, not to like say that, all peptides are good, but 80% of the supplements sold on Amazon either don't have what they say they have, or they have less than they're advertising. And so it's kind of the same thing. Like just know who you're buying from. Like all the supplements that I buy, like I know they're from reputable companies that do third-party testing. Same thing with like any peptides that I get access to is I know where it comes from, how it tests out, and I'm regularly looking at those things. So it's tough because, like we'd love to be able to tell people like, hey, there's an abundance of compounding pharmacies and there's no issue with it. But unfortunately, the world we live in now is kind of,
well, and the challenge is, there are just not a lot of companies that are going to spend the hundreds of millions of dollars to take these through testing. Yeah. And the reason they're not is because even if the evidence is there, it's very difficult to keep somebody from making these, on a black market, so to speak, if you will. Yeah. And then once again, like I have a very good friend of mine who used to live in Belize, and he was on testosterone, and it was just going through all kinds of rigmarole to get testosterone and get his doctor to prescribe it and everything else. And down in Belize, you just walk in the grocery store and buy it off the shelf. Yeah. So, this was the, and he was like, and I go, this is exactly the same because it's exactly the same manufacturer, exactly the same vial. Yeah. And yet, we vilified testosterone for years in the United States because of the bodybuilding community and some of the abuses. And yet And all of the things that they told us, it's going to cause prostate cancer, it's going to cause heart disease, and all this. It turns out none of that was true. Just same thing with women's hormones. So I think that's, I think, look, buyers need to be aware, right? Obviously, and there are different ways. So me, trust but verify. I think that's a great thing to think about. So let's talk a little bit else, because one of the things we're really focused on at Fountain Life, and when we talk about optimization, not just the hormones and obviously getting growth hormone up, which is super important, but it's metabolic health. So I want to talk a little bit about the mitochondria, which is really the power plant of the cell. We all remember from high school biology, right? I mean, it's the power plant of the cell, and what we knew about the mitochondria then, 30 years ago versus what we know today is very, very different. And now I know, and we should talk about some of the peptides that are available now and some that have just gotten recent FDA approval. And then, so let's talk a little about the mitochondria and how critical that is and what these peptides are that are available.
Yeah, if you look at, like a lot of things in the body, natural processes through environmental stress, through aging, through all those things decline over time. The mitochondria are a big piece of that, particularly when you look at oxidative stress on the body impairing mitochondrial function. So that could be environmental. Could be mean that like we're exposed to bad food, bad water, toxins in the air, pollutants, things of that nature. That causes oxidative stress. Too much exercise causes oxidative stress. Yeah. If you tax your mitochondria too much exercise, that's going to have a negative side effect. And so when we look at the mitochondria basically being those power plants, if we're throwing too much in there, think of like throwing a wrench into them. You throw enough wrenches into them, eventually they're going to stop spinning and they slow down. And because of that, kind of the energy cycle in the body, look at like the electron transport chain, ATP, and all these things start to slow down. Well, what happens? Practically speaking, we get fatter, we get sicker because that's starting to slow down. So what's cool is with peptides, we have things that can address that. And there's a really cool peptide. I've been a fan of it for a long time. It's called SS31. This is actually another endogenous peptide. So we all have SS31 walking around in us. And as we age, of course, those levels decline. But what SS31 does is it binds to cardiolipin, and then by doing so, improves the actual structure of our mitochondria. And so when we look at someone that's aging, like I said, keep throwing wrenches into it, they're going to stop spinning, and then like everything gets jammed up in there. What SS31 does is it actually is kind of remodeling the hardware of the mitochondria. And it was actually it's funny how like drugs and peptides work, right? Because there were these guys and they were working on people with mitochondrial myopathy, another syndrome called Barth syndrome, which is a genetic disease. And that's originally where SS31 kind of came from a drug pipeline standpoint. But along the way, it kind of made its way into the research world. And then people said, hey, well, if it helps with mitochondrial health, it could probably help with some of these things. And we start to find out that it helps clean up reactive oxygen species. So it helps some of like that oxidative waste byproduct that's building up over time. Actually just recently got approved for Barth syndrome. And the dose I think is like 40 milligrams per day intravenously. But what's cool is that for someone that might not have Barth syndrome, which is obviously a severe genetic deficiency, you can use a much lower dose to get this therapeutic effect of remodeling the mitochondria. And so the same way as like maybe testosterone or estrogen declines with age, mitochondrial function declines with age, especially relative to our environment. Mm-hmm. And we can use a peptide like SS31. I think SS31, what's cool about it is I've talked to so many people that have used it. I've used it extensively myself. There's not necessarily what you would say is like this, like super turbocharge effect or anything. Mm-hmm. Like you're not going to take it and feel like superhuman, but what it does, the same way that a lot of like mitochondrial health agents do, is improves the function, remodels the hardware of the mitochondria, and in doing so, allows all those processes to work a little bit better. So what you'll notice is if you use SS31, even at a low dose, sleep just gets a little bit better. My exercise gets a little bit better. Even in mice studies, it's something crazy like the aerobic capacity goes up by like 30 or 40% in aged mice when they're using SS31. Even in human trials for Barth syndrome, their 6-minute walk test goes up, I think something like 15 or 20% when they're using that because it's improving the aerobic capacity of the mitochondria, which ends up leading to all these energy related things. So it's really cool. And when we talk about like aging and longevity, again, we have GLP-1s, right? But do we need to use those at a high dose, or can we use like a tiny dose? And then we have, hey, like here's a tiny dose of SS31 that improves mitochondrial function, which is going to clean out some of the oxidative byproducts and the ROS in the body. It's going to improve energy efficiency. It's going to like help you sleep better and all those things that kind of just feel better. And there's use cases actually in like chronic diseases for it. So like chronic kidney disease massively helps people with chronic kidney disease.
Really? Wow.
I've seen people, this is just like anecdotal, but I've seen people with like a GFR of like 55, that are like right in that range, like in 8 weeks, like double their GFR and get it up
on SS31.
Yeah, just with SS31.
Nice.
It does a lot. Like and again, this is like anecdotal. So like, this is not published studies or anything, but I've seen guys like in their 80s take it and their PSA drop from like 9 to 2. And so it's like, oh, okay, like it's improving mitochondrial health, but what in the world is going on that it's like in the matter of like,
so that's interesting.
Months.
I think that's an interesting point, because I think one of the things, there's the Warburg effect, which is really highly tied to cancer. And so it's mitochondrial dysfunction. So whether we're talking about senescent cells and mitochondrial dysfunction, or we're talking about cancer cells and mitochondrial dysfunction, there's kind of a theme here. So by the way, now that SS31 is FDA approved for one indication, it can be used off label. Is it going to change the availability? I mean, is somebody going to lock down the ability and block that from other compounding pharmacies from being able to make it?
I hope not. And I hope if you look at the name of the company that's on it, I won't name names. Yeah. It doesn't start with an E and end with an L. So it seems the companies with the largest legal defense funds are the ones that are basically in this battle.
I see.
And if you look at the owners of that, I don't remember specifically who owns that one. In a way, I think it actually brings more attention to like a smaller pharmaceutical or biotech company that has that. And maybe it makes it like an acquisition target for a larger one. But I hope it brings more attention to it, because when you look at like peptides, we say like, okay, well, if someone's coming into the peptide world, they're going to trust probably FDA approved peptides more. And so it's like, hey, well, now I can use that off label. And then I think with SS31, relative to like the GLPs, which have so much street cred and media cred and everything, where it's like, who's talking about SS31? Right. And so like the more we can get it out there, I hope that's the case. And maybe that does happen eventually, but it's kind of like whack-a-mole if you look at it. And it's going to be this battle like back and forth of, okay, well, we have SS31, but now there's MOTS-c, and now these other
so let's
mitochondrial peptides.
We should talk about MOTS-c, because that's been around a little longer. And what are your views on MOTS-c in terms of versus SS31 in terms of one versus the other?
I love MOTS-c. Another works distinctly different than SS31 mechanistically, but still has like a really good effect. I will say MOTS-c is probably, again, another endogenous peptide that declines as we age. It has much more of like a performance enhancement benefit for people, meaning that like, someone might take SS31, they may or may not feel anything, but you get their blood work done 6 or 12 months later after cycling it a few times, and you're going to notice something in most cases. Whereas MOTS-c, most people within, a very short time horizon are going to notice like, man, my energy is like through the roof in a good way. Like I have like better insulin sensitivity. And again, to go back to GLPs, like if people just had a GLP plus a little dose of a MOTS-c, what they would do for fat loss, because MOTS-c is working on the mitochondria, then you have a little bit of GLP stimulation, is so powerful. And it also too, a lot of times when people are taking GLPs, like those are so powerful at inducing a calorie deficit to help people lose weight. What happens when we have a calorie deficit without a GLP? We get tired, right? Because we don't have as much food and we're burning more calories. Well, MOTS-c helps kind of like bring that up, because it improves mitochondrial function, which then raises energy levels, which for someone that, might need to lose weight is going to help them get to the gym and do all of the lifestyle things. So I love it from that standpoint. But again, there's tons of data, especially around heart health, of improving like cardiac function and improving heart tissue that's there. So I love MOTS-c. What I like to tell people too is like, what's cool about like the mitochondrial peptides is you can almost use like cycle MOTS-c and SS31 at different times throughout the year and get an amazing effect over time. Because what SS31 does is it kind of, if you think about like building a house, it's going to like help repair the foundation. It's going to fix the holes in the walls, and MOTS-c comes in and it decorates it and it makes it really nice inside. And so it's more of a software remodel for the mitochondria. And I think people, just based on my experience, they get more of like a performance benefit, meaning that they'll probably see a little bit more fat loss. They're going to feel it if they're exercising, like their VO2 max is going to go up.
Right.
And so there's a little bit more of a performance benefit from that. But again, the difference between a pill and a poison is the dose, because some people will do like 10 milligrams when I would recommend staying with like, half a milligram or 1 milligram. And sometimes it can be so powerful, it actually can like induce hypoglycemia in some people, or actually cause like a little bit of anaphylactic shock because it's so powerful. And again, whereas like SS31, because of the nature of how it works, you wouldn't see that as much. You'd have to go probably to like a dose to where it would just become cost prohibitive. Whereas with like MOTS-c, you can get to a like pretty cheap, depending on where you're getting it from, dose that becomes like, wow, like that's like kind of making me like tachycardic or hypoglycemic because it's so powerful at modulating insulin sensitivity.
So we obviously we're going to open a Fountain Life in LA sometime next year. And let's talk about the Hollywood community.
Yeah.
There's no group that's probably more eaten up outside of maybe the UFC fighters with peptide stacks.
Yeah.
And so you hear a lot about the Wolverine protocol. So what are these common ones that you're seeing in in really the celebrity community? Because, they're the first to try everything. And then if they find it, they really glom onto it. And we have some, actresses and actors that don't look like they're aging very much, and obviously, it's not all plastic surgery. So, I mean, what are your thoughts around, those stacks that they're doing, like Wolverine, for instance?
Yeah. So Wolverine would be typically you hear BPC 157 and TB 500. And I don't know who coined that. It was one of the greatest like marketing in the peptide world, whoever coined it back in the day. But basically it helps you heal much faster. What's taken off a lot is what you've probably heard of as the GLOW protocol, which is actually BPC, TB500, and GHK, GHKCU, which is the copper peptide. And what's unique about those three things is when we look at like inflammation, injury recovery, but then also too, just kind of like an overall anti-aging effect to like skin health and hair health and things of that nature from a very like aesthetic perspective. They're helping with angiogenesis, which is helping blood flow around the body. TB500, that's going to be your BPC. TB500 is helping with stem cell migration. So if you have an injury site, it's going to help get stem cells to that injury site. But if you're injecting it subcutaneously, it's also just going to help improve the amount of stem cells circulating in the body in general. And then you have GHK, which is like the GHK is one of the GHKCU is one of like the most multifaceted peptides because it works like at a DNA signaling level to do a bunch of things. It like helps with collagen synthesis. So primarily like if you were going to inject it into an injury or people are injecting it into their face, it's going to help with collagen synthesis in those areas. But it's doing a ton of other things too. What's crazy is like, this is what I do all day is like go and, read stuff about this, is that there's actually evidence to show, I believe this is in animal models, the GHKCU reverses emphysema. And it's because at a DNA level, it's going into those inflamed cells, particularly in lung tissue, and saying like, okay, the DNA is now transcribed to express emphysema. Let's wind that back and express a more youthful state. And so it's actually doing that. So counter to like what a lot of people would think is like, oh, well, I'm going to take the GLOW because it's going to make my skin glow. Yeah. It's actually having a lot of these other ancillary benefits that people don't realize, which in tandem will probably make people look better aesthetically. But those three right there, what's cool about them is you can inject them into an injury. So if you have like a torn shoulder or torn knee or something, you could inject them in that area to help with repair. But you could also inject them systemically just to help with overall health and gut health, lung health, all those things that they're going to help in the function of doing. But I would say from like an aesthetic standpoint, whoever invented, the Wolverine and now the GLOW protocol, which is those three together, it's amazing. And I think, again, when we look at those, all three, TB500 is a fragment of thymosin beta 4, which is another endogenous peptide, but BPC, thymosin beta 4, GHKCU, guess what? All endogenous to human body. And from the time someone is 20 to they're 60, their GHK levels are going to drop by 80%. Wow. And so you take, a man or a woman that's 60, all of a sudden you help GHK restore back to youthful levels. Now what's going to happen? Their skin's going to look better. Their bodies are going to recover faster. So pretty cool. And again, for people in the peptide world, they've been using those forever. Yep. But for someone that's new to this, it's amazing to like see them for the first time, like say like, hey, I took this and like all of a sudden, like this like shoulder that I've had that's been bothering me for years, like the pain's just starting to go away and help repair. And it's because we're giving the building blocks to be able to get some of those processes the body's trying to do anyway, but just doesn't have the tools.
So let's talk about administration, because one of there's a lot of controversy. I mean, there are people with selling sublingual preparations,
Yeah.
saying, oh, it'll absorb and, sublingually like we do other drugs. And we've done that for years. There's others injected, there are oral forms. I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean, you obviously are an expert in the field, because I look at these and like, so for instance, BPC 157 is kind of one of those FDA ones where the FDA doesn't know. So they just, some people say, yes, you get it. Some people say you can't. But obviously these are stacks, and I mean, can all three be combined? Are they best injected? Are they best sublingual? Are they best, oral? I mean, what routes and what do you recommend, obviously, for people?
Yeah, it kind of depends on what you want to use it for. So I would say, like, okay, let's say that we have shoulder issues. The most direct, efficacious way is going to be to inject it into the site. Now, that doesn't mean that you could take it like subcutaneous in the belly and still not yield some benefit. But if we're talking about an injury, usually a site injection close to the site, you might not want it directly into the site, but close to the site is going to help. And then when we look at some of those other ones, what I'm actually really excited about is companies right now that are working on bringing some of those alternative delivery mechanisms into a way that's efficacious. So some peptides, even those three that we just talked about, BPC, TB500, and GHK, you can get some bioavailability orally out of them. Now, how much is it enough to help heal a shoulder? In a lot of cases, no, but it might help someone with gut health. So if they have leaky gut, you might get enough out of it to help repair the gut lining, which is going to help some, like autoimmune diseases in some cases. So there's that, but I think there's two that are really cool. One I know is that they've actually developed buccal mucosa, or I don't know if you pronounce it buccal or buccal mucosa.
Either one, usually, but
buccal.
Depends on what part of the country
you're
from.
I'm from North Carolina, so
yeah,
we say buccal. But you can put it on your tongue, and then it sticks to the roof of your mouth.
Yeah.
And then it absorbs systemically through the bloodstream in there. So I've actually tried these before. And although maybe the injection, if the injection's, a 100% 10 out of 10, I noticed that I get like 60 to 70% efficacy out of them. Yeah. But then again, it's like, okay, well, if you have a torn shoulder, it might not be the best to absorb it that way, because it's going to be like injecting it into your belly to where it's like, doesn't have the practical application. But for hair health, I've done a GHK buccal administration before. I wake up and the next day, for me, like people, it darkens hair because it's working to like help hair. GHK is, a very powerful hair health peptide. For me, if I get like a little grays in my beard, I'll wake up the next day and then my beard is like jet black.
Wow.
And then I'll get like more, my hair will start to get a little bit darker. And so I know it's working. So although it's like, if I tore my shoulder, it's probably not going to help as much absorbing that way. There definitely is efficacy. And I've even tried like a CJC buccal, absolutely like improved my Oura Ring sleep scores, helped my deep sleep and everything on my Oura Ring. And so that's an efficacious one. One that I'm really excited about, I'm actually probably going to be trialing these soon, is there's a company that's developed patches that actually has micron needles that they have published data to show that you reach the same serum concentration levels as a subcutaneous injection. And it's actually needles, but what's cool about it is you apply the patch, you leave it on for 20 minutes and you take it off, and it feels like you just put a Band-Aid on, but there's small enough needles to where it can like puncture the skin to get efficacious delivery into the subcutaneous fat tissue and then deliver the peptide. And what they've been able to do is pretty much synthesize every peptide that we have, in the compounding pharmacy space or the research space onto those patches. So I'm excited to try those. And the reason is like, yeah, is injection going to be the best delivery system? In most cases, yes. But I was talking to the nurse earlier today who was doing my blood work and my IV. And I said, I'm fine with needles. Like I've never been bothered by needles. But I said, how many people sit down with you and they start like hyperventilating? And she's like 80%. Yeah, and it's like, well, if 80% of people aren't going to inject something, what does it look like when we can get some of these things? Because we could talk about the benefits of peptides all day, but if someone's scared to inject, they're not going to inject, let alone go out of their way to source it from a compounding pharmacy or the research world. So I'm excited for those, even if they don't work as good as the injections, just the fact that people can get the therapeutic benefit from them and say like, oh, okay, like I can use, BPC or
Mhm.
GHK, and it works more than maybe like, some like collagen supplement that I bought on Amazon. Not that those wouldn't work for what they're trying to do, but I'm excited for those because it's hopefully going to expose more people
Mhm.
to peptides. I mean, GLPs have done a pretty good job, right? We probably have like
Sure.
100 million people that have been using those. But I think it's going to expose more people to some of the wonders and benefits of them. So we'll see where that's headed. But I think if I had a crystal ball and I could say like, okay, if I could wave my wand and get the most peptides to the most people to help the most people,
Mhm.
you would have to find a way around the injection
Yeah.
problem because you're always going to run into that where people just like don't want to inject.
Well, we have a lot of people that a lot of our members, they have them, but they don't want to. They're terrified to take them out of the country
Yeah.
because then you
Yeah.
got to take them out, and then they're like, oh, hey, what's this?
Yeah. Yeah.
And oh yeah, you have a syringe, and you've got this unknown vial here.
Yeah. It's got a bunch
and-
of letters on it
yeah,
that
and
says,
you're just
like,
telling me it's peptides, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
so I mean, this is the challenge, and so a lot of them just don't take them, and
Yeah.
so they're gone, in the summer to Italy, and then they're off of everything. So I'd like to kind of wrap up and talk about peptides for cerebral function and neurodegenerative issues and neural function. So because we talk about all the Wolverine stacks and they're really popular, and you kind of the weight reductions and all that, but obviously neurodegenerative and neurocognitive issues are huge. Things like cerebral lysin and things. So what's available out there that people might find interesting and things that they might be able to get?
Yeah. So there's a couple peptides. These have been used in Russia for ages. So probably going back to the 1950s, there's published information in Russia. One's called CMAX, another one's called Selank or C-Lank. And basically what those are, they're kind of like modulators of neurotransmitters. I wouldn't say, like, a lot of people look to those as kind of like nootropics to like, hey, so like I'm going to like massively like enhance my brain function the way that someone taking like a stimulant would. And they don't really work that way because they help modulate neurotransmitter function.
Mm-hmm.
But when we look at neurodegenerative disease, healing inflammation in the brain is going to be one of the most powerful things over time. So I really like those, not so much because you're going to get like these crazy effects from them, but just because like over time, it's one of those things that can kind of be like a background insurance policy on making sure that we're minimizing inflammation in the brain. GLPs are obviously good because of not what they're doing to the brain. I mean, we do have GLP-1 receptors in the brain, but because of what they're doing from a metabolic level to stem the tide of neurodegenerative disease from like, amyloid plaque buildup and all the things that come from that. But there's two that I'll just throw the name out there because they're really cool. And there's like some research being done around them right now. One's called J147. And that's actually it's an orally bioavailable peptide that you can take. And what that does is it enhances mitochondrial function in the brain. And so creatine is all the rage right now in our world, right? Because of the brain health benefits, because it's increasing mitochondrial function in the brain, increasing the amount of ATP they can get into the brain. And J147 is doing that. It's just a little bit more potent than a creatine is. So I've used that. It does work to like increase focus slightly. But what I would be interested to see is like over time for people that have some of these neurodegenerative diseases is what that helps do, because if we can increase the amount of oxygen, the amount of ATP and everything that's getting to the brain is going to help more blood flow, obviously, which then will hopefully lower inflammation, which then stems the tide of those. There's another one called P21, and P21 is actually, if I'm quoting off of memory, right, a component of cerebral lysin. So it's a peptide that is in the blend that they make when they're making cerebral lysin. And so it's kind of like cerebral lysin light, but it's one of those that no one really knows about. And also too, from a regulatory standpoint, if we're saying like, okay, well, like cerebral lysin so powerful and maybe powerful people want that shut down, P21 is going to kind of give you like 50 or 60% of the benefits of it without maybe drawing the attention of cerebral lysin, because cerebral lysin being porcine, there's like a lot of stuff that goes into the quality control, and then they can use that as like fodder for like information to maybe stop it from getting out. But P21 is really cool. What I like about it is it helps modulate neurotransmitters in the brain, but also bring down inflammation. So we don't have a ton of human data on it right now, but if you look at mouse models, when they give it to mice with Alzheimer's disease, it brings down all of those inflammatory markers related to brain health and everything. So I'm excited about that. Actually, and I don't talk about this publicly too much. The way I found out so much information just because I publish information. So I
Yeah.
get people that reach out to me. What I found out was that I got tons of messages from parents with autistic children,
Mm-hmm.
and they would use P21 as a nasal spray, and they said it would like clear up like 80 to 90% of the symptoms
Really?
of autism, because it's helping in a lot of cases. Autistic kids may have like dopamine or serotonin dysregulation, and so
Mm-hmm.
it kind of affects their mood, and it would improve a lot of their symptoms, help them with mental clarity, help bring down to like more of like a stable kind of, emotional state. And I was like, wow, that's pretty interesting. You start looking up data, and it's like, well, it was actually in the pipeline because it was an Alzheimer's peptide that's been used. So I've used that one personally and seen other people use it to great effect. So that will probably be one like years from now. Obviously, cerebroliacin is amazing at doing what it does, especially when we look at like stroke and Alzheimer's disease that's like more late stage, to where you like actually will see like reversal of it. So I love cerebroliacin. The only issue,
Can you get that now? Is it? Is it?
it's tough. It's
Yeah.
really
I
tough.
mean,
So
yeah.
there were actually compounding pharmacies. I believe this was like last summer. Compounding pharmacies and research companies were selling it. I know the research companies that were selling it got letters from the FDA,
Mm.
which is kind of funny because these research companies were selling tirzepatide, which is like, what the FDA cares about going
Right.
after.
Right.
And they didn't even care about it for that. And they went after cerebroliacin, which market wise is like pennies compared to the amount of GLPs.
Yeah.
Because, like a lot of people out there buying it. That basically was like a cease and desist. So I know that happened. I know a lot of compounding pharmacies. So there are ways to get it. It's just one of those things from like a commercial supply standpoint, because a lot of the cerebroliacin that I know of comes from Russia, or like not Russia, but like the Eastern Bloc, to where it's like made around Russia because there's plants there that make it for hospitals there that it's used, and
Sure.
hospitals that they have there. And so a lot of it's coming in from overseas. But yeah, it's tougher to get, but if you can, absolutely amazing. And I would say, for someone that is already like got good brain health, you might not want to use it maybe more than like one cycle a year, or even one cycle every 2 years.
Mm-hmm.
But for instance, like, with me, like a lot of my mentors and former football coaches I talk to them now, and they're like, in their 60s, and I can see them having this cognitive decline because
Mm-hmm.
they had a lot of head trauma. And I was like, man, if I could get them some cerebroliacin, it would help. If it's like 20% progressed, because I saw this with my grandmother, like 20% progressed, like stop it in the tracks there instead of letting it get to like 80 or 90% to where it like might be too late for something like that.
So look, I get to sit here and ask a ton of questions, and we could go on for hours. What I'd like to end with, though, is we do a lot around longevity. I mean, what is in your mind the optimal longevity stack for somebody? Let's say, I mean, our average age is 50 in our company.
Yeah.
Of our members that come in,
Yeah.
and we have CEO types and hard chargers, and they're at the top of their game, and they want to stay at their top of their game.
Yeah.
But what in your mind, the go-tos that should be part of everybody's stack?
Yeah. Just quick hitting, I'll go through what I would say: a microdose of a GLP, whether that's semaglutide, tirzepatide, or whatever comes in the future. I think a microdose of those in the right form or fashion, absolutely component. And again, that's irrespective of whether a person needs to lose weight. Obviously, it would help if they do need to lose weight. The second one I would say is SS31, like we were talking about from a mitochondrial cell standpoint. Third would be a growth hormone peptide or a growth hormone releasing hormone, ceramorelin, tesamorelin. I actually advise people to kind of like alternate through those and see which ones you like, because everyone's going to have a personal preference.
Mm-hmm.
And you can cycle them so you don't necessarily build up tolerance to one and find out what you like. Fourth one would be, it is technically a peptide, would be glutathione. I love glutathione. Actually got a glutathione IV today.
Yeah.
Feel good.
Sure.
But I'll do that like 2 times a week intramuscularly.
Mm-hmm.
And from like an immune health standpoint to an antioxidant defense standpoint, since I've been doing that, when I look at like some of those inflammation things on my blood work, cholesterol panel, inflammation markers and everything, liver health, I mean, it's crazy what glutathione can help do for that. Just one of those things it literally is a pain in the butt because it stings if you're injecting it.
Yeah.
And obviously doing the IV is cumbersome too. And then the last thing, this is not a peptide. One thing that in the last like 2 years that I've seen completely transform, and the data on this that's emerging is crazy, is the SGLT2 inhibitors.
Mm.
And I forget exactly what SGLT2 stands for. But anyway, what that does in principle is it blocks the reabsorption of glucose by the kidneys. So what that means is that for people that are on the blood sugar roller coaster all day, which obviously creates all the metabolic havoc that we're talking about, you end up peeing out the excess blood sugar. So relative to the benefit you get from that, you do have to be careful with it because you can get like UTIs and things of that nature if you're using too much of them. But the benefit I've seen to people using those with GLPs, like a microdose of a GLP plus an SGLT2, is insane. Like how good they work together. And I think there was a couple of recent meta-analyses published. Like there was when you have those two classes together, so a GLP and an SGLT2, 50% reduction in all-cause mortality post-heart attack when you have both of those together. And so it's like, how would diabetic drugs end up improving heart health that much? Yeah. And it's because it's taking that metabolic burden off of the body. So I don't know where that ends up going. If I had like a crystal ball, I would say like that class of medications for longevity purposes will become one of the greatest things that we have ever. And then even in the short term, maybe that doesn't come true, but in the short term, like what it's doing for people's health that I've witnessed firsthand, from like reducing high blood pressure, reducing cholesterol. For me, like taking in the course of a year using those myself, my HDL went from around like 45 up into like the high 60s, low 70s, which independent of like anything else that I had been doing before. And again, it's like, well, it's not directly doing that, but by like alleviating some of like the metabolic burden that we all bear from living and having to eat and do stuff, it does cool. So I'm excited about those. We'll see where it goes. Obviously that's not like, what it's prescribed for now because it's a diabetic drug, but there's more and more people in the longevity community that are figuring that out and then using it to be a part of their protocol to help with.
So what I love about that is every one of those things you put in the stack, because this is for our physicians who are nervous about peptides, but everyone you just talked about is available.
Yeah.
And they're not like, we're not talking about you
have to go like, some crazy website.
Yeah. We have to do research only.
Yeah.
And so I think this is important because we're working on what is the longevity stack for our physicians. And look, we have some physicians that are very cutting edge and we have others that are more nervous. And so, this is kind of a gray area, but I love that. But look, I really appreciate this. Was great. Very educational. I learned a ton. I'm sure our listeners will learn a lot as well. I have learned a lot and appreciate all your work and look forward to having you back again.
Yeah. Thank you guys. It's been amazing here. I've only been here half the day, but I cannot rave enough about how nice everyone has been, how about like, given all the clinical stuff I did today from a testing standpoint, how much of like a spa environment it was, which you're talking about like doing, like CT scans and MRIs and stuff. That's usually not like a very welcoming, warm environment. It's very sterile in a lot of cases. So I can't thank you guys enough. I'm excited, whatever we do in the future is going to be awesome. And the more I can help just get information about peptides to people, it's so powerful, the stuff I've seen in my life and the people I've coached and stuff. And if, I can help anyone by doing that, that's what I'm here for.